Doctor and Romana stared at the exterior view screen, lost in thought.
What is this place?
Romana asked, frowning. The Doctor was similarly bemused. Somewhere which, apparently, no one has bothered to name. I am certainly not familiar with it. Romana snorted slightly.
Well, that makes a pleasant change,
she said with a wry smile. The Doctor gave a single silent chuckle, only detectable through the motion of the Doctor's head and shoulders, and the faint burst of breath through his nose. He nodded towards the view screen. Pleasant, you say? The picture on screen was unusual, to say the least. The TARDIS stood on what could best be described as savannah, stretching away for quite some distance, before finally being interrupted by low hills. However, no matter the eventual variation in geography, there was an unsettling uniformity in tone to their surroundings. The sky was blue, broken by the odd white wisp of cloud, a sight which would look almost earthly or Gallifreyan, but for the slightly darker shade of blue. The ground, however, was another matter. As far as the eye could see, all was a slightly orange shade of red. Close to the TARDIS, the cause of this coloration became obvious. Everything was covered in gently swaying plants of this very distinctive pigmentation. To call them plants was a somewhat creative use of the term. They had a strangely rubbery or fungoid aspect to them, their fronds being oddly reminiscent of certain sticky silicon stress toys as might be found in the hands of many on 21st century Earth. There was a slight breeze which seemed to be making them sway, and this motion continued until it was lost with distance, although presumably the hills were equally alive to this dance.
It is a little, hellish, isn't it?
Romana suggested. Well, that's a very human-centric way of viewing it, particularly for a Time Lord, the Doctor pronounced, aloofly. Romana snorted again.
You're a fine one to talk,
she said derisively.
Okay, how would you describe it?
Glorious! The Doctor cried, spreading his hands wide. Gloriously hellish. He then added, offering Romana a sly smile. Romana chuckled.
Fine. Well, should we risk going out and taking the breeze? I mean, there is some fairly unusual looking fauna out there.
The Time Lords could tell that the red vegetation was waist-high due to the scattered figures apparently wandering the savannah at random. None seemed closer than 100 meters from the TARDIS, and indeed none of them even seemed to be looking at the TARDIS. All these individuals appeared to be looking in random directions, and what movement there was seemed slow and hesitant. Most were too distant to reliably make out their species, but it was clear that no two were alike. There was no commonality in form to these strange inhabitants. One of the nearest might have been Jadoon, but it was difficult to be sure. The Doctor studied the view screen, then moved to a different panel of the main console, flicked a few switches, and looked at the readouts there. He tutted and shook his head. Well, the air is sweet and clean, according to the exterior sensors. No harmful microorganisms, at least not to us. There really doesn't seem to be a good excuse to stay inside. Romana nodded.
Yes, I agree. It all sounds far too positive. What about evidence of bulk incursions?
She asked. The Doctor shrugged. The divide between our reality and the rest of the bulk is perilously thin here. I'd be surprised if there weren't any incursions in this world. But as to specifics, neither K9 nor the TARDIS can identify any strange occurrences. Romana nodded her understanding. The Doctor stuffed his hands in his pockets. So, shall we go for a stroll? He asked. Affirmative, Master, K9 piped up. The Doctor shot him a warning look. I wasn't talking to you. No, K9, you've told us where the local source event is, and the foliage looks a little sticky for you. Best you stay here and let us two do the heavy lifting for a change. Understood, Master, K9 responded obediently.
In answer to your question,
Romana chipped in, a little impatiently.
I think exploring our surroundings is an excellent suggestion.
Together, the Time Lords mounted the stairs to the main doors. They whirred open as they approached, allowing them to enter the savannah beyond. The two Time Lords scanned the scene before them, peering at every detail.
The inhabitants. That's strange. They all seem to be facing away from us.
Romana remarked. Probably just a trick of chance. They may appear to all be facing away from us at this moment, but they are all still, in fact, facing in different directions. This unusual spike in their directionality is not necessarily an indication of significance, or indeed design or plan.
Perhaps.
Romana responded, not entirely convinced. There were two other features of note on the plain before them. Both were strange artificial constructions. The first stood perhaps 200 meters away and looked eerily like a water tower. Indeed, minus the studio insignia, it looked very much like the Warner Brothers water tower. It had a few more vents and short lengths of piping projecting from its body than the studio emblem, and there seemed to be a grilled window on the side facing the TARDIS. However, its 4 long metal legs and white paint job did still evoke this image. Beyond that odd construction stood the second point of interest in their immediate vicinity. Around 300 meters beyond the tower, and slightly to the right of the direct line of sight from the TARDIS to that construction, there was a single low hill. At the top of this hill, a sturdy palisade wall had been constructed. Tall tree trunks had been sourced from somewhere, cleaned, prepared, then driven in tightly so that no gaps existed between them. There did seem to be the suggestion of some sort of gate, again on the side facing them, constructed of the same materials. At this distance it was unclear if this fort was occupied or not, but it certainly looked recently built. The Doctor and Romana stood shoulder to shoulder as they studied these two artifacts before them.
So,
Romana said briskly,
shall we take a look at the tower, stroll to the fort, or pop over and chat to some of these distant wanderers?
The Doctor was about to reply when something bumped into their backs. Both spun around in surprise. They stared in horror at the Dalek. Romana made a sharp intake of breath, but the Doctor held up a finger, cautioning silence. Mute, they now regarded the rear of this most dangerous of creatures. They were forced to survey the Dalek from this unusual angle, since it had backed into them. The Doctor and Romana looked at each other wordlessly, then nodded as both agreed on the sensible course of action. They took a careful step backwards. Barely had their feet come to rest when the Dalek ran into them again, then also stopped. Now the Doctor tugged at Romana's arm, and together they tried to edge around the Dalek to get a better but discreet view of its front. The attempt was in vain, however, since as they moved the Dalek rotated, always with its back to them, and always in contact. The Doctor again held up a finger as an idea struck him. He gestured for Romana to stay where she was, while he attempted to edge around to the Dalek's front. The war machine seemed unsure of what to do. It jittered back and forth hesitantly, as if fighting to point its rear at both Time Lords simultaneously. However, it seemed the desire to remain in its current position, pressed against Romana, ultimately won the day. The Doctor could finally see the Dalek's single eye, and although he must have crept into its peripheral vision, it still did not turn towards him. Most curious, the Doctor muttered to himself. Romana took this as a sign they could now risk being heard.
Doctor, what is it? What can you see?
It appears to have something in its eye. What the Doctor saw was eerie and unnerving. It seemed that the Dalek's eyepiece was entirely filled with some sort of black goo. Indeed, some of this same substance had oozed past the seal around its lens and had begun to hang down in oily tendrils towards the ground.
Doctor, could you perhaps give a little more detail?
Romana asked, a tad impatiently. Absolutely. It seems this being is infested with something not dissimilar to the bulk entities of the Mondasian rats and the Earth penguins. Romana looked aghast at the Dalek, and in particular to where it was touching her.
Didn't you say they drove people mad with their touch? And how come our landing was so smooth? It must have been quite close to us when we landed in order for it to have sneaked up like that. It was probably just the other side of the TARDIS from the main doors.
The Doctor held up a warning digit. I said not dissimilar. However, This must be some variant or cousin of those beings. Obviously, the effects you describe are not shared by this variety, whatever it may be. At that moment, the doctor noticed an odd figure jumping up from hiding in the red vegetation, about 20 meters behind Romana. He was dressed in a cream button-up shirt, a leather satchel over his shoulder, and dark glasses pushed up to rest on his forehead. In one hand he was holding what looked like an ornate walking cane. With his other, he was gesturing wildly at something behind the doctor while staring the Time Lord directly in the eyes. Then he ducked down to disappear back amongst the plants. Both the doctor's and Romana's attention had been entirely absorbed by the Dalek, but the doctor now scanned their surroundings. Their investigations with the alien killing machine had caused them to drift a little way from the TARDIS, which now stood about a dozen yards away. The figures who had been scattered across the plain were still there and were still all facing away from the two Time Lords. Only now they were mere meters away. Many of the figures stood between the two Time Lords and the TARDIS, and indeed were closing to form a ring around the pair and their overly affectionate Dalek companion. No two figures in the ring shared an origin. There was a grubby-looking Cyberman, a Jadoon with slumped shoulders and a non-standard outfit, more of a mercenary, it would seem, than the regular Jadoon Enforcer Service. Many more races were represented here, several not immediately easily recognizable. The only similarity was their contradictory attitude to the two Time Lords, all shunning them with their backs, yet closing ever tighter upon them. The Doctor and Romana tried to run, but only succeeded in dragging the Dalek with them, then running up against the other figures in the circle they had inevitably run towards. These odd, reversing, slow-moving beings now began to crush in upon the two Time Lords, increasingly restricting their movement. Indeed, it was rapidly becoming painful for them both, and their breathing ever more laboured. At that moment, the lone animated individual suddenly leapt from the undergrowth very close to them. As he did so, he pulled his walking stick in two. He used his momentum to knock two of the figures pressing the Time Lords off their feet, while yelling, "Duck!" As best they could, the Doctor and Romana pulled their heads down. They managed this just in time, as something long and narrow sung through the air mere millimeters above them. The head of the Dalek was suddenly separated from its body and sailed through the air. Their rescuer was in possession of a sword cane. Quite a formidable one at that. "Come with me if you want to live," the swordsman said, nodding in the direction of the water tower. His voice had a slightly Australian quality to it, but it was always hard for Gallifreyans to pinpoint people's origins from their tone alone. Such was the price of their effortless understanding of a billion tongues. But for now, such questions would have to wait. They were off and running. They followed hot on the heels of their rescuer as the red foliage stuck and clung to their clothes, leaving behind red smudges. The Doctor examined his suit as they ran. "We shall have to get the TARDIS to dry clean us when we get back," he observed.
If we get back,
Romana responded, nodding behind them. Their pursuers were definitely slower than the Time Lords and the new stranger. Walking backwards was a clear disadvantage in that regard. However, they were relentless, and their numbers far higher than before, or at least the density of these beings in the Time Lord's immediate vicinity. That said, there was some distance between the three fugitives and the crowd upon the savannah as their rescuer at last reached the nearest leg of the metal construction. He instantly began to climb a ladder built into this steel support. "Quick, follow me up. Trust me, we'll be safe enough inside." The Doctor and Romana looked at one another questioningly, but neither felt in any position to argue. They rapidly scaled the ladder after the man. At the top of the support there was a narrow observation walkway running around the body of the tower. The swordsman opened a door whose appearance and operation shared much similarity with those of a submarine. "Please, come inside," the man said with a grin. "My home is your home." All three entered the cone-roofed metal cylinder. The door closed behind them. Their initial impression of a submarine was strengthened still further upon first seeing the interior of their rescuer's home. All the furniture and fittings were metal and had a well-worn, slightly grimy patina. A hammock had been slung between one part of the curved wall and a nearby section, the curvature of the wall allowing it to hang freely and slightly out into the centre of this single room. Every other item of furniture was integrated into that wall. A bench, formed by an extrusion of that same surface about knee-high, ran around the entire chamber, save for where the entrance lay. At various points around this seat lay a sink, what looked like a food preparation station, and one part of the bench contained a lid which looked ominously sanitary in nature. At the centre of the room stood a thin-framed vertical ladder leading to the ceiling, presumably to give access to the roof and to allow maintenance to be carried out. The Time Lord's host gestured to the bench.
"Have a seat. My name's Rongad. Anthropologist by trade. Swordsman by necessity."
As he said this, he hefted his metal cane to illustrate his point.
Thank you,
Romana said while taking a seat. The doctor remained standing, brooding. Romana glanced at him with a quizzical expression, but continued her conversation.
I must say, it is a surprise to find a human scientist here. Wherever here might be, that is.
Rongad flashed her a grin.
"A human scientist? How do you know I'm not a Gallifreyan one?"
Romana looked taken aback.
You know of our race?
She asked with surprise.
"I saw your ship land. Not many vessels to mistake that for."
Are you Gallifreyan?
Romana continued.
Or human?
The grinning Rongad looked about to reply when the doctor cut in. "He's neither." Romana and Rongad both turned to regard the doctor. Rongad's grin, while now a little surprised, had widened still further. He spread his arms wide, inviting the doctor to continue. "He's an Argond," the doctor announced without fanfare.
An Argond?
Romana responded, shocked. Rongad's grin remained, but for a fraction of a second the colour and texture of his eyes shifted to give the briefest impression of orange reptilian ones. Then in an instant they had returned to a human or Gallifreyan appearance.
Doogie Rev,
Rongad said approvingly. "They are infamous shapeshifters," the doctor added casually.
Guilty as charged. Although we do like to appear in the same form as our guests, for their comfort and peace of mind."
Romana nodded knowingly.
That explains a lot. I couldn't quite believe you were Gallifreyan. We Time Lords have something of a sense about our own race. Not always 100% reliable, but still.
Rongad inclined his head towards her.
"Some things you just can't fake."
"I thought your race extinct by this time period," the doctor added matter-of-factly. For the first time, Rongad looked a little thrown off his stride. As he responded, his bravado sounded a touch more forced.
"Well, I mean, you know, I haven't seen another of my kind for quite some time, but we always were something of a rare sort. Still, we can't be extinct. I'm the living proof."
"That is undeniable," the doctor conceded cautiously.
"Besides, you Gallifreyans are hardly ones to talk."
Rongad scoffed. "The reports of our race's death are greatly exaggerated," the doctor replied casually. "Anyway," he then continued, "Rongad, perhaps you could enlighten us as to the nature of this strange world, its name, its peculiar inhabitants, how they and you came to be here." Rongad moved to sit a quarter of the way around the room from Romana. The doctor sat down next to Romana.
"As to this place, it has no name, except the one I gave it. I call it End of the Line. You'll see why by and by. What brought me here is no doubt the same thing which brought you. The same thing which brings everyone. Rumours. I'll wager your reasons, mine and theirs, may all differ, but the tales guided us here just the same."
The doctor held up a finger. "Let's just assume for the moment we arrived here by chance. Indulge us and tell us the tales, if you will." Rongad tilted his head in a gesture of generosity.
"Whatever you say. The tales are two-pronged, but both forks lead back to the same place. A tale of a world which comes and goes in history. only accessible from certain places at certain times. A part-time world, if you will. Then there was another tale. Whispered stories in shady bars of desperate souls. Hunted or haunted people. People near death, or expecting its knock at any moment. And these people all seeking a world fabled to allow them to escape their fate. To live beyond their date with death. Both tales were sketchy and fragmented, but slowly I was able to piece the details together. Enough to find this world at any rate. So I hired passage on a freighter, paid them enough to drop me here in this survival pod to conduct my research. Hopefully paid them enough to come back and pick me up once all this is over. I guess we'll see. And then I set about my main goal, to study these people who fled here, those who sought to cheat death.
Would I be right in thinking they are the ones we encountered outside?
Romana asked. Rongad nodded.
Ah, yes, the survivors. I'll bet their fate was not what they'd been hoping for.
Quite, the doctor agreed gruffly. But why are you studying them? Are you too feeling the Grim Reaper's breath upon your neck? Rongad laughed.
Oh, come on. Wait. Who are you both? Pardon my lost manners. I've been alone for a while now, more or less. I'm a little rusty.
Romana.
Romana responded with an indulgent smile. The doctor supplied a little more coolly.
Doctor, Romana,
Rongad said, nodding to each in turn.
Surely you both know enough about the longevity of the Argond to realise I have no skin in the game here. What you see is what you get. Oh, you know what I mean.
Rongad added those last words in response to the doctor's sceptical raised eyebrow.
No, my interest here is purely academic, and really, when you get right down to it, a personal curiosity about, well, everything. I mean, I might write a paper about what I discover, for posterity, I suppose, but such considerations are leagues below my own innate desire to know.
As Rongad finished his account of his motivations, his house seemed to sway ever so slightly, as if buffeted by a gust of wind. Have you seen these survivors before? The doctor asked. I mean, have you looked one in the eye? Rongad inclined his head towards the doctor with a knowing grin.
I can tell you, Herr, from your question. Yes, I've seen them up close before, from all angles. Risked my life for my studies on many occasions. Yes, they all share those same eyes, or rather, they all seem filled with the same black goo, and they are all attracted to the living. Yes, I know what you're going to say.
Rongad interrupted himself, holding up his hands to forestall rising interjections from the two Time Lords.
Why do I distinguish them from the living? Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. But I do know they're attracted to anyone not filled to tears with oily goop. Their senses also seem utterly disconnected from how they were when they were normal, walking backwards, clearly sensing the living on that side of their bodies and moving ever closer to them. And if enough of them get close to you, well, that's it. They crush the life out of you by sheer weight of numbers. I've seen it before. I'm not the only researcher to turn up here over the years, and few of us have survived.
The doctor nodded his understanding. Yes, they do seem somewhat possessed. You certainly showed an interesting technique when dealing with them, he said, pointing towards Rongad's sword stick.
Yep. They keep on coming right up until you separate their head from their body. Then the game is over.
Rongad agreed grimly.
An impressively sharp blade,
Romana interjected.
particularly given its size and weight. You completely decapitate a Dalek.
It's all in the wrist.
Rongad claimed with a wink. I rather think it's all in the blade, the doctor responded coolly. Eleventh material, if I'm not mistaken. Rongad raised an eyebrow.
Most impressive. I found a deposit in the hills to the east. Burnt out the atomic manipulator, forging a blade out of it to replace the regular steel one McCain had originally.
As Rongad said this, he pointed to a blackened and charred device built into the wall. It had definitely seen better days.
Nth material,
Romana asked with a puzzled expression. Material from the multidimensional realm, metal from beyond our universe, material of the bulk. The doctor's answer was delivered sternly, his eyes not upon Romana, but instead narrowed in assessment of Rongad. Romana now also turned to regard the Argond anthropologist.
Your people have the ability to recognize and manipulate material from the 11th-dimensional plane. How much do you know of what is going on here?
She demanded. All playfulness and patience vanished in an instant. As she said this, she rose to her feet, the doctor matching her movement. Rongad now also stood up and looked back at the two Time Lords equally shrewdly.
While our respective knowledge may not overlay exactly, I doubt there's anything you can tell me I'd find difficult to comprehend. For instance, I'd not be surprised to learn if something from the bulk had infested all of the unfortunate survivors out there on the plane. Would not be surprised if this had occurred once their expected deaths had finally caught up with them, leading to half-remembered tales from the companions or other witnesses of life after death. After all, he continued, hefting his sword stick in his hand, where there is one bulk deposit, why not others? This was the theory I was beginning to formulate, at any rate.
The two Time Lords and the Argond all stood looking at each other in silence for several moments. Finally the doctor spoke. You may very well be right that we have similar perspectives on this matter, and complementary information.
Have you noticed any other commonalities between these survivors? Although perhaps victims might be a better label.
Romana asked, complete with suggested relabeling. Then she was struck by a further thought.
The Dalek's casing was very dirty and marked, but I thought I saw a strange, possibly alphanumeric symbol on it. Before you sliced right through it, I mean.
Rongad looked about to answer when the doctor cut in. Oh, probably just some sort of military identification. There have been all sorts of factions and splinter groups amongst the Daleks over the years. For all we know, it could have been some Band of Brothers tattoo. Rongad looked about to speak again, when this time it was his own home which butted in. The water tower had moved again, but this time far more significantly, rocking back and forth. The hammock continued to sway even after the room returned to a steady state. It seems to be blowing up for quite a gale out there, the doctor noted. Rongad looked horrified.
There are no high winds on this planet,
he cried, rushing towards the small square window nearest to him.
Oh no,
he said, ominously quietly. The room now swayed again, more violently than before. The doctor and Romana, who had been trying to make their way over to Rongad, were nearly knocked off their feet. Unsteadily they joined him at the window. From the narrow grated opening before them it was difficult to look directly down, but by pressing their foreheads against the glass they could just see where the nearest two support gantries met the ground. The savannah at the base of the water tower heaved with bodies, all facing away from the tower. Those nearest pressed up hard against the supports, their push being amplified by dozens, perhaps hundreds, more radiating out from the tower into the plane itself.
Whenever I climbed the tower before, they always dissipated. I was wondering if it was because I was out of sight or just far enough away for them not to sense me. That was why I was practicing hiding in the red undergrowth when I found you, to see if this disrupted their sensing. But I was totally wrong. How can they be sensing us in here?
The doctor turned to look Rongad in the eye. And then there were three, he said grimly. Rongad was about to reply when the tower shook and lurched again, this time failing to return to a fully upright position. Romana and the doctor fell towards one side of the central ladder, while Rongad was thrown to the other side.
There are too many of us,
Rongad wailed in frustration.
Too many in one place. Too much life.
Perhaps not for much longer, the doctor cried back as the tower now lurched in the opposite direction to which it had been leaning before. Only this time it did not stop. The doctor struggled to his feet, his ears ringing. He could not be entirely certain if the ringing was solely in his head, or if there were some residual vibrations in the metal life pod following its crashing impact with the ground. The doctor continued to groggily take stock of his condition. Had he lost consciousness when they hit? He shook his head painfully, but in denial. If he passed out, it was only for a moment. He looked around him in search of Romana. The room lay on its side and was quite crumpled and distorted by the landing. Indeed, the roof had popped off completely, and the red vegetation of the savannah could be clearly seen through the opening. Fortunately for now, none of the survivors on the plane could be seen there. A pile of seating cushions near the doctor suddenly shifted and tumbled from where they lay. Romana rose unsteadily to her feet amidst them. Both the Time Lords looked around themselves. Of Rongad there was no sign. "Quickly, Romana! We need to find our rescuer. He clearly knows more about this planet and what is going on here,"
Agreed,
Romana said, nodding. Together, helping each other as they went, they struggled along the debris-strewn wall and out of the opening left by the missing roof. Now outside they could see how they had fallen and why, for the moment at least, they had been spared a crushing assault from the survivors. From the crushed vegetation and bodies it was clear the tower had fallen, then rolled to where it currently lay. The broken plants had spilled their ruddy sap hither and yon, releasing its perfume into the atmosphere. And oh, the sweetness of the air! The roof was some distance away, in line with where it had been thrown by the initial impact. As was Rongad. Like the Time Lords, Rongad had found his feet. Unfortunately, so had around half a dozen of the survivors. They had him pinned in the middle of their group, but he still had one arm free, the one clutching his sword stick. Unfortunately, he had no other free hand with which to draw the blade.
Rongad! Hang on! We're coming!
Romana cried encouragingly.
"No!"
Rongad yelled back, still attempting to grin in spite of the pain. Still more of the survivors were slowly joining the press, squeezing him ever more tightly. Romana took a step towards him, but the doctor held her arm, looking at her sorrowfully. He silently shook his head.
"Hey, Romana! I've got something for you. Catch!"
As Rongad said this, he used his free arm to fling the sword stick in the direction of Romana.
Almost without thinking, she caught it in her right hand.
"Take care of it for me,"
Rongad said to her, almost gently. Then he turned his attention to the doctor.
"Will, you said you thought we were extinct. You might just be about to witness that very thing. Feast your eyes on history in the making."
The doctor shook his head in frustration. "I'm sorry, Rongad. I wish there was something we could do." Rongad grunted as the pressure upon him increased, and with it the pain.
"Just get yourself safely to High Point. It's the palisade on the hill behind you. I know the people there. They'll help you. As for me, I guess it's finally time I joined the rest of my people."
Having only just finished his pronouncement, he then cried out in agony.
"Ah, no! I had not expected this! Ah!"
Rongad's words dissolved into a bubbling death cry of pure agony and snapping bones. Then his head flopped limply on his neck, unsupported. Rongad was dead. Romana's head dropped forward, eyes seeking the floor, while her knuckles whitened as she gripped the sword cane with both hands. The doctor had never lost eye contact with Rongad throughout his final moments, but now he turned to Romana. "Let's make sure we keep that safe," he said, nodding at Rongad's weapon. Romana looked at the doctor, eyes filled with a bitterness and frustration which more than matched his own. Nevertheless, she signalled her silent agreement. Together, the doctor and Romana ran away from the slowly encroaching survivors, forced in the direction of Rongad's suggested destination. There were currently too many of the shuffling aliens between them and the TARDIS to make that a viable target, for the moment at least. That said, as they ran through the sweet-smelling air, fragranced by the red flora which lay crawling across every surface, they were able to steadily increase the distance between them and their unnatural pursuers. They reached the base of the hill now, High Point as Rongad had called it, and found the flaming plant climbing even here, right up to the wooden palisade itself. Indeed, some of these red vines were even beginning to scale the lower reaches of this timber wall. The Time Lords climbed now too, heading for a portion of the palisade which seemed to contain two distinct sections, gates to allow entry. They stood now before the gates, but as their eyes scanned the tops of the walls, no one could be seen. "Excuse me, could you please let us in?" the doctor cried. The only answer was silence.
We're friends of Rongard.
Romana chimed in helpfully. In spite of the volume of her cry, her voice was still tinged with sadness. The gate swung inwards and open. Together, the doctor and Romana walked through the entrance. As they passed the threshold, the gates swung closed behind them, revealing their operator. A short young woman, dressed in black raw leather trousers and waistcoat, complete with other items of light leather armor and fittings. She was also carrying a black bow, a bow she currently had trained at the doctor. "Ashilda," the doctor said simply.
Do you know this girl?
Romana asked.
Woman.
Ashilda corrected. "Yes, I know her," the doctor replied coldly.
Head towards the center of the compound.
Ashilda ordered.
We don't want to attract the survivors.
The doctor and Romana turned towards the center of the enclosed area, but immediately failed to comply.
That is a TARDIS!
Romana cried.
But neither of these people are Gallifreyan.
The causes of her surprise and not a little outrage were twofold, and both stood about 20 meters away at the very middle of the hilltop. The first of these was the TARDIS itself, although in its current configuration only the keen eye of a Time Lord, and a most perceptive one at that, could have identified it as such. Currently, it appeared to be a small roadside American diner. "Today must be the day for American retro-themed vehicles," the doctor noted. The second cause of Romana's consternation stood in front of this TARDIS. She was dressed in dark trousers, a white shirt, and a light grey woolen jumper. She had dark brown hair cut in a bob, and to the sharp senses of the Time Lords was clearly not Gallifreyan. Ashilda waved the doctor and Romana towards the centre of the hill with her bow once more. And this time they complied. Together, the doctor and Romana came to a halt just in front of this new, unidentified woman. Ashilda stood behind them and slightly to one side. The doctor half turned his face back in the direction of Ashilda. "You, I know," he said slowly. Then he turned to fully face the woman before them. "But you, I don't know. And I never forget a face." The doctor said this with an air of certainty, yet a haunted look about his eyes betrayed the lie.
Doctor, what is it?
Romana asked.
Do you know her?
The doctor frowned, shaking his head. "I know Ashilda. Know her well, I think. I accidentally made her immortal. My apologies again for that, Ashilda." Ashilda rolled her eyes, looked unimpressed, and simply shrugged noncommittally. The doctor continued his assessment. "The other, I know I should know. But all there is a void in the shape of a person. I can almost tell you who, but I can't quite put my finger on it." The woman before them smiled a knowing smile, tinged with sadness. She took a step towards the doctor.
Then let me put my finger on it for you,
she said, and with that touched his forehead between the eyebrows with her right index finger. The doctor reeled backwards, as if struck by an electric shock, stumbling with legs buckling, forcing Romana to catch him under his armpits to prevent him collapsing completely. Still supported by Romana, the doctor's head lolled around loosely on his neck, his eyes rolling in their sockets, mouth slack. Then suddenly his head snapped forward, his eyes now fixed and staring intently straight ahead. He recovered his footing and gently removed Romana's hands from under his armpits with a brief nod of gratitude. "Clara Oswald," he said simply to the woman before them, tight-lipped but with a slight smile playing around the corners of his mouth.
Well, who else, you silly old fool?
Clara said with a chuckle. Romana frowned.
You do know her, then?
"Well, yes and no," the doctor replied. I mean, I didn't know her until about 10 seconds ago. Didn't know her for all the time we've been travelling together. But yes, I know her now, and I knew her before. Clara chuckled again.
Maybe it'd be better if I explained.
She said helpfully.
Maybe it would.
Romana responded in a guarded manner.
Well, you see, I used to travel with a doctor. This doctor, as it happens. And the one before. But then, unfortunately, I died due to an incident with a quantum shade.
Romana narrowed her eyes at Clara.
You seem to be weathering death remarkably well,
She observed.
I know, some of us can really pull off the whole walking corpse thing with aplomb, can't they? No, I really can't claim the credit here. It was the doctor who saved me.
Romana raised an eyebrow at the doctor. Yes, it's all my fault, he said levelly.
I'm afraid so.
Clara continued cheerily.
But as you will soon find out, not quite everything went to plan. Anyway, the doctor used the Gallifreyan extraction chamber to freeze my life between heartbeats and extract me from the universe.
Romana stared at Clara with calculating eyes.
That is a very delicate mechanism, wherein a plethora of things might go wrong, unless it is treated with the utmost respect and care.
She said coolly, with a hint of warning.
So I have heard, but I think the doctor may have had some help working the extraction chamber.
Romana continued to stare levelly at Clara.
I wasn't talking about the extraction chamber.
So, Clara, what happened after we wiped my memory and you literally, in every sense of the word, vanished from my life? The doctor asked.
Oh, this and that.
Clara said matter-of-factly.
Obviously, Ashildr had her own TARDIS at the end of the universe, and so we headed back to Gallifrey in it. At least that was the original plan. To go to Gallifrey. The long way round. I mean, I figured we didn't have to go straight back and reinsert me in the time stream. Just so long as that was always our planned final destination. My very final destination. My fixed point in time.
Ah, I see, the doctor said. The long way round. Yes, been there, done that. I can quite understand the appeal. Clara shuddered a little at this.
Well, maybe not that long way round.
The doctor batted her concerns away with a wave of his hand. No, of course not that way. Anyway, what did you do on your grand tour of time and space? Clara smiled as she recalled her journey.
You know, the usual. Doctory things. Visiting planets, finding trouble. Solving problems. Same old, same old.
The doctor nodded. Very commendable, but something changed, am I right? Clara frowned and nodded.
The TARDIS, our TARDIS I mean, alerted us to a cataclysmic event. The whole of space and time fragmented, and the fragments, ours included, began to dissolve. So our grand tour became a very targeted mission of mercy. We visited places where the universe seemed most in danger of disappearing, or where the thinness of the universe was allowing things into our space-time, endangering those living here.
The doctor nodded. Yes, that was how we found you, your trail of good deeds. I don't mean to nitpick, but you seem to have done a few of these acts of benevolence in a bit of a rush. A little slapdash, perhaps. Not wishing to demean your efforts, of course. Clara frowned.
Well, we were under a little pressure. What with the whole of time and space falling apart.
Then she smiled a little.
Besides, I more viewed us as fingers in the dike. We knew you'd be along sooner or later to properly clear up the mess.
The doctor inclined his head graciously. Very kind of you. Your faith in my skills is most reassuring. But I sense that there was another pressure hastening your course, particularly as we approached this current place and time. Clara stared directly into the doctor's eyes.
The Raven,
she said with deadly earnest.
The Raven?
Romana chimed in. The quantum shade, the doctor explained tersely. Clara Oswald nodded her agreement.
Yes, somehow, with the shattering of the universe, the quantum shade, the deadly Raven, learned how to traverse time as well as space. The first time he appeared on a planet we were helping, Ashilder and I almost didn't recognize it for what it was. That was the closest I've ever come to dying. Well, apart from the first time, of course. At first it could take weeks before he would finally catch up with us at a new location in space-time. But eventually, over time, the lead we had over it shortened. Now, it is a matter of days before he catches up with us, usually. Barely enough time to settle down and help anyone before he chases us on again. So, what brought you here?
Romana asked. Clara sighed and looked downcast.
We thought we'd found a way to defeat the Shade and save the universe. We discovered how to track the Shade through space-time. It was easier than expected. We were already monitoring weak spots in our fragment of space-time within range of our sensors, in order to target aid, but then we noticed trails between places we have visited. Lines of stress or weakness. And these were the paths the Raven had flown, straight as an arrow between one encounter and the next. The quantum shade chasing us was tearing the universe apart.
So why come to this odd world? The doctor asked.
We had heard rumors on our travels of other people who had been hunted by quantum shades. Other marked beings like me.
At this point, Clara quickly turned her back on the Time Lords and raised her hair to show the black tattoo upon her neck, the timer on 0 in a strange script. Then she turned back to face the doctor and Romana.
The legend said that those who sought to avoid the fate of quantum shades simply had to find this unnamed world. And when the shade found them, as long as they were standing on this planet, they would leave on past the end of death timers.
But it wasn't what you had hoped for, was it? The doctor offered sympathetically. Clara shook her head.
No, not at all what we had hoped for. The people who had fled here had all been fugitives and criminals, marked for death by the quantum shades. But when death found them, it took them just the same. And before their corpses could even fall, something else had taken up residence. Something from beyond our universe, if Rongad's theory is to be believed.
The doctor and Romana shifted uncomfortably at the mention of Rongad's name, but chose not to mention anything of his death at that moment.
And so, here we are.
Clara concluded, a little deflated.
Nothing to show for our visit, and all the while the quantum shade tearing through the universe, quite literally, to get to me.
Romana looked thoughtful.
So you believe the quantum shade is tearing apart the universe?
She said, almost to herself. Clara nodded. Just then a klaxon rang out from the diner behind Clara.
The Raven comes,
Ashilda announced grimly.
Doctor, what do we do?
Clara asked desperately. Ashilda, where is the shade? The doctor asked. Ashilda pulled a small device from a pocket and glanced at it.
About a kilometer north of here,
she reported. The doctor wheeled on Clara. Clara, do you trust me? Clara nodded, her eyes wide.
Always.
The doctor nodded in recognition of this. I have a plan, but everyone has to do exactly as I say. Is that clear? Clara and Ashilda nodded quickly. Romana stayed still. The doctor gave Romana an intense stare. Somewhat reluctantly, she inclined her head. Good. Now, Ashilda, Romana, you need to take Ashilda's TARDIS to find the builders of the quantum shades. You must persuade them to dismantle them, all of them, for the good of everyone. Monitor my TARDIS, and either find us in space and time if you're successful, or, if you find we're on Earth, come to us, as we will only have returned there once this is over.
But where are we going?
Clara asked, bewildered. We, the Doctor announced confidently, are going to outrun the Shade in my TARDIS. Then we shall defeat it the old-fashioned way.
Which is?
Clara pressed. Intelligence, guile, and cunning, the Doctor proclaimed with a grin and a nod. Clara smiled at his confidence and bravado. Romana gently grabbed the Doctor by his upper arms and turned him towards her.
You know you don't have to do this. Not this time. We could trade roles. Let me take the weight for once,
she said earnestly, staring into his eyes. The Doctor stared back into her eyes with equal intensity. No, I do. It is my responsibility. Always has been, always will be. Everyone's safety is in my hands, and mine alone. We each have our role to play. Yours is to keep Ashilda on task. Mine is to run like the Doctor with Clara Oswald. Romana pursed her lips at the Doctor, but released her grip upon his arms and nodded curtly. Then she turned and dashed with Ashilda back into the American diner. As the Doctor and Clara ran back towards the palisade gate, the diner began to wheeze and grind as it faded in and out of existence. Clara opened the gates, and together they strode through to look out across the savannah. Between them and the Doctor's TARDIS there was still quite a high density of survivors scattered about, and in the case of the nearest, now slowly wandering backwards towards them. Far away to the north, distant, but heading right for them, was a slowly growing black speck. The Doctor turned to Clara, grabbing her hand with an excited grin. "Run, Clara, run!"